Hi, today, the 21st of May, we are continuing our series of the National School of Prosecutors with the dialogue, interdisciplinary dialogue, the pandemic coronavirus. And we have the great pleasure to hear from Professor Jorge Cavalcanti Boucinhas Filho. Professor Jorge Boucinhas Filho is a remarkable researcher of the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, and he is also a professor of that university. He is a fellow of the National Academy of Labor Law in Brazil. Professor Boucinhas, social constitutionalism is very close to labor law. And we could say that labor law was born at the same time of the social constitutionalism. But in fact, we would like to know what is the importance of labor law for economic development.
Well, that's an excellent question, especially because we normally see the labor law as an obstacle to the economic development. And it is actually extremely important for the economic development, especially in developing countries as Brazil, because it is essential for the income distribution that is the basis of a search for social equality. So to stimulate the consumption, you must have labor law to share a little bit of the richness among rich and poor, and to allow those poor to have access to the consumption market, and doing this to help the economic development.
Thank you, Professor Boucinhas. And there is a very important issue that I would like to go through. And we are all very concerned about the pandemic coronavirus. Unfortunately, this problem is related to every single country in the world. Therefore, here in Brazil, we must face the problem of coronavirus in terms of enacting legislation to solve the problems of the coronavirus in terms of work relations. So my question is, what are the legislative solutions to face the crisis of the pandemic coronavirus here in Brazil?
At first, the Brazilian government decided to adopt a very, very liberal political measure, the MP 927, that actually didn't, they didn't want to participate in the problem. They let employees and employers to solve, by the way, using the traditional measures of fighting economical crisis previewed in the Brazilian legislation, Brazilian labor legislation with a little increase in its flexibility, but the government didn't want to participate in the monetary expenses of the measures to face the problem. It has a terrible reaction of the crowd. The population started to criticize enormously the government. And a few days later, the government decided to change, and it changed 180 degrees its politics to adopt some politics where it decided to open the safe, the national safe, and to try to prevent dismissals and loss of income of the enterprise by trying to subsidize the check roll payment of the enterprise, and to give a little bit of social aid to the employees, trying to prevent the dismissals and of course the bankruptcy of the enterprises. So we can say that at first the Brazilian government, a very liberal government, at least in its political discussions, changed from I would say an Adam Smith-based politics to a John Maynard Keynes politics few days later. So I would say that realizing that in this moment, in this crisis, with all its particularities, being extremely liberal wouldn't help much, the government decided to participate in all the economic losses of the problem, trying to help the maintenance of the economic activity and the maintenance of the regular based life of the employees, at least as much as it's possible with all the restrictions we have due to the health problems.
That is undoubtedly a great idea, and I thank you for bringing up this idea. Edgar Morin, who happens to be the most remarkable philosopher in Europe in nowadays, he said that this pandemic coronavirus crisis is responsible for a very particular consequence, a healthy existential crisis, a healthy existential crisis. And it is undoubtful that the pandemic coronavirus is something very different from any other thing that human being has ever seen in history of mankind. Therefore, I would like to ask you, how is particular the pandemic coronavirus crisis, and what do you think about its consequences?
Well, it is indeed extremely different from all the previous economical crises. You know, here in Brazil, we have I would say that we have regular economical crisis. So we the Brazilian, we can deal with them, we can cope with them normally without much problems because we are, I would say, they are habitual in our daily lives. But in this case, it is indeed extremely different from the previous crisis, especially because it affects the consumption, the global consumption, in a very, very different way. People is not consuming because they can't get out of their houses, because they are, most of the global population is locked in their own houses without the possibility of have even the regular consumptions. And when you affect the consumption, you affect, of course, the production, and affecting the production, you create menaces for the employment, menaces for the payment of the taxes and everything. So the whole structure, the whole economic structure starts to tremble. So the great particularity of this crisis is that it is a huge, a global, and a very, very insolid consumption crisis, and therefore to try to reestablish the economic development after it ends, we cannot have people without the power of consumptions. So we cannot let workers to impoverish themselves, and we cannot allow the enterprise to close their doors. So this is why in this particular crisis, the role of the state is so essential and so important. And this is why the Brazilian government did indeed a very, very good movement in recognizing that liberal measures wouldn't help much to try to face this problem. To reestablish our economy, we must have workers and enterprises in conditions of restarting its consumption and paying all the taxes and all its debts.
Thank you, because when we are talking about this crisis, we also have to talk about the obligation of the government to enact legislation in order to preserve jobs, to protect the economy. So I would like to know what kind of legislation was enacted by the Brazilian government in order to preserve jobs?
Well, the Brazilian Constitution, as you know better than anyone, allows the reduction of salaries and the reduction of the journey, the regular work journey, in order to try to prevent dismissals. So it is something we called a measure of trying to solve or trying to face economical crisis. We have other measures in our legislation. For example, we allow the suspension, a temporary suspension of the employment contract to try to allow enterprises to face their regular crisis. We have the possibility of collective vacations. And in this particular crisis, due to this, to all its particularities, we have the possibility of using the teleworking, the home office, as a measure to try to face the crisis. Actually, what the government did at first was just to try to reduce the formalities, flexibilize a little bit the rigidity of the law and the requirements to use all these measures, and then realizing that it would have to participate with investing some of its money, it create some programs to give to the informal workers an emergency income to allow them to continue their lives, give the employees help in cases of reduction or suspension of the employment contract, and to give to the enterprises the possibility, some kind of allowance to let them pay their employees. So I would say that the most important measures were related with this allowance to the enterprises and with this emergency income to the employees.
Thank you again, Professor Boucinhas. And I would say that I'm completely sure that your ideas will be responsible to clearing up every single doubt about the Brazilian legislation in terms of labor law in times of coronavirus. And finally, on behalf of the National School of Prosecutors, I would like to thank you again. And I would also like you to make your closing remarks addressing prosecutors and all workers that will certainly have access to this interview. Thank you, Professor Jorge Boucinhas.
Well, I'm the one that must thank you for the opportunity, for this conversation, for the invitation of the Brazilian prosecutors to participate in this quick chat. And my final mention is just as an optimistic one, that I really believe that, and I hope, but actually I really believe that we will get out of this crisis soon. And I'm pretty much sure we will get out of this crisis better. We will get out with, I think, this solidarity feelings we can feel now during the pandemic crisis will continue and will guide our lives after everything passed, and after we restart our lives as it was before.
Thank you. And here we finish this series of interdisciplinary dialogue, the pandemic coronavirus. See you soon.